Before we move into the question and answer part of the panel more generally, I'd just like to get some reactions from Jim and Andrea as to...
I'll try and be more profound then, since I'm double mic. Many thanks for having me here. Wonderful initial exposition of the topics, and it's great to be able to speak to a very well-informed crowd. I think we can have a high-level debate. A couple of things that I wanted to pinch out of what I thought was an excellent, thorough presentation is about fit for purpose. To ask that question requires that we reflect, and we were talking about this before, what's the purpose? And if we look at the initial purpose of IHL, in layman's terms or layperson's terms, it really began as a mid to late 19th century gentleman's agreement among European powers with regard to some limits that should be imposed on conflicts between armies of, or constellation of armies, depending on the conflict, of roughly equal military capacity. And why that's important is because the logic of international humanitarian law, which has jus ad bellum, when a state can go to war, as one key element, and jus in bello, we're in a situation of conflict. What are the rules? How can we best protect, or should we best protect civilians? The logic of it begins from a gentleman's club agreement in effect in the late 19th century, which excludes the global south, the barbarians and the colonized, who are, over the next century and a half, in addition to being brutalized, they're also conceptualized as outside the realm of the legitimate norms. They become the enemy combatants of the post-9/11 era. I'm not going to speak to that except to say I think you did, and that's something that we should discuss. One thing I want to say as someone who's fundamentally dedicated his life to civil society, and this is my last comment, is if you think of jus ad bellum and jus in bello as two parts of an overall framework of an agreement among roughly equal states, there's some logic to it. The analogy that I like to use is if Muhammad Ali were in his prime, were to fight my grandmother, my nonna, who was about 4'6" and weighed 80-something pounds soaking wet, okay? It would be clownish for us to say, you must both follow the Marcus de Queensberry rules. Nonna, no punching below the belt, right? Et cetera, et cetera. The only reasonable advice that I could give to my grandmother to give her a shot would be precisely to violate the rules of the conflict, right? When Muhammad Ali is waving to the crowd, grab your stool and hit him over the head. It's the only shot you've got, right? So that, and now here's the last bit about civil society. We in civil society, I worked for Human Rights Watch for years, and a lot of people don't know this. Human Rights Watch has absolutely no position on jus ad bellum. Despite the fact that there's one large state that has been involved in scores of conflicts since the Second World War. It's located between Canada and Mexico. I have a passport that says the name of this country on it, but I don't want to call anybody out. Despite the fact that there's one country that has promoted scores of conflict, generally speaking, civil society doesn't engage in addressing the question that you so rightly recalled is the main event. The main event is jus ad bellum. It's aggressive war. That's Article 6 of the International Military Tribunal, this, Article 6 of the statute of the IMT. The most important crime is aggressive war. That is now institutionally, structurally overlooked. I don't think IHL will be fit for purpose until there is a reimagination and a rededication to the idea of addressing, which you said was not addressed, addressing jus ad bellum. That is stopping wars from beginning rather than abdicating from the fundamental responsibility to say, this is unacceptable, you cannot be engaged in this conflict. But once you're engaged in the conflict, we're going to killing of civilians and violations of the principle of distinction and necessity. Too late. Most of the decisions, most of the slaughter has already been predetermined. So those was sort of what I wanted to add, but I thought great exposition, and happy to continue debating with all of you.
Thank you. We'll go to Andrea for her remarks, but just before I do, a reminder, QR code, scan it, whatever questions you've got, hopefully should come to me. There's free Wi-Fi if you need Wi-Fi to fill out the form, so just sign up, fill it out. If you're having problems, put up your hand, someone will come to you and take your question, and somehow or another it will make its way to me. Andrea.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thanks, IAMLA, for the very kind invitation. I'm very glad to be here on this panel, and I also can see I share some Italian heritage with my fellow panelists, as well as a very short grandma or nonna, so it's very nice to hear. I do have a lot of thoughts and reaction to Nada's very powerful speech, but I'll try to just limit myself to a few points that hopefully adds up and are different from what she already said, which I agree with. So I think what the three of us are highlighting is the obvious inadequacy of the mechanisms that we do have in international law to address the concrete problems that we see from the conflict. So the legal infrastructure is built historically and continues to be built on this legacy of state-centric views of international law. Human rights has tried to infuse some more human-centric approaches to the law, but with very clear flaws in itself. So we continue to be bound by a normative framework within which we as lawyers strive to frame our normative claims in a way that is effective to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. But we, as I mentioned, we are constrained by this limitation, and this really limits our ability to enhance human security and advance the objectives that we have. But at the same time, on top of the inherent limitation of the mechanisms that we have, that Jim has pointed out, we also see a clear lack of willingness to act on the limitation that we do have, on the legal standards that the law does provide us with, on the hands of state, on the hand of the international organizations that we are meant to protect the same normative constraints, the same normative objectives. So we heard about in the initial remarks on the limitation of the United Nations, the veto powers that are in itself a problem, but are also obviously politically instrumentalized. So there is a lack of willingness of the states themselves to use the law and the institutions in a way that is effective to protect the security of their own population and other populations in the world. So, and this is quite evident. And I want to focus on something sort of not new, but that is right now becoming more prominent, I think, in the field of international humanitarian law, which really demonstrates how even the IHL norms that we do have are easily disregarded because of the state-centric approach of international law. And that is the privatization, the increased privatization of humanitarian aid in areas of conflict. This is becoming particularly evident with the privatization of, let's say, the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the post-conflict futures of rebuilding Gaza. So we know the widespread attacks on humanitarian organization and aid workers in Gaza as well as elsewhere. We also know that Israel has continues to prevent humanitarian organizations to operate in the Gaza Strip and is placing some specific limitations that most of these organizations are not in the position to accept, and therefore they become unable to concretely deliver any aid and support as the local population, regardless of the ICJ proceedings that telling Israel that they should let humanitarian aid enter Gaza. But there is more than this. And that is the increased privatization of humanitarian delivery, which is something that goes outside of legal framework of international humanitarian law, which is a normative framework that is focused on putting state obligations and duties and constraints to the actions of states. And it does not extend or is unable to regulate and address the behavior of non-state actors, such as humanitarian organizations, but also private enterprises that take over from the state to deliver those humanitarian aid. And here, on this, I draw, I might say not on my own research, but on ongoing research by Yulia Msteva and Khaled Al-Mahmoud, who I had the privilege to read, even if it's not published yet. But they delve into a lot of details of how the current situation in Gaza is characterized by an increased use of private corporate actors that are driven by profit and therefore are inherently inadequate to address the humanitarian needs of the population that they are meant to be protecting. I think everyone will have heard of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was used in lieu of public, let's say, humanitarian or international humanitarian organization to deliver aid to Gazans, to Palestinians in Gaza. And obviously, as most of you will know, eventually it turned into a killer zone and a situation where the humanitarian aid was used as a way to perpetrate further killings of the population rather than achieving the objectives they were meant to achieve. But that is not the only one. That's not the only private company that is currently involved in Gaza, or that will be involved in Gaza in the future, at least based on the so-called peace plans that promoted by the United States and somehow endorsed by the UN Security Council. I have a few data. There are several private companies that have been and continue to be involved in Gaza. The Gotham's LLC, a U.S. disaster response and detention logistic contractor, which is lining up to become one of the main actors in post-war economy plans, Another company is Affinity Partner, which is linked to Jared Kushner, who is the U.S. president's son-in-law, and is the promoter of Gaza so-called plan for large-scale redevelopment, or the waterfront project, whereas they are envisioning to build waterfront luxury tourist facilities across the coast of the Gaza Strip, and so on and so forth. So there is an increased involvement of private actors in what should really be either a reconstruction project led by the international community, but more prominently, something led by the Palestinian people of the Gaza Strip. But this is not within the picture that we have now, and it's increasingly delegated and outsourced to private contractors and private actors. Now, why is this important for our legal assessment? Well, because international humanitarian law, as I mentioned, is inadequate to restrain and regulate the activities of private actors. When functions such as delivery aid or the obligations of an occupying power to make sure that the local population are met with their basic needs are delegated to private actors, then the law itself is just inadequate inherently to deal with this type of situations, because it doesn't necessarily place obligations on those actors. And this, just to conclude, I think really resonates with what the UN Special Rapporteur for the situation in Palestine. Francesca Albanese has mentioned in her, I think, quite famous report on genocide and on the economy of genocide, where she highlighted how the long-lasting involvement of private actors in contributed to settler colonialism and the genocide, and ended up in the genocide in Gaza. So I think this is the next phase of Gaza, and possibly in a lot of other contexts of conflicts that we are seeing, is increasingly at risk of being delegated to profit-driven private actors, and this is very dangerous for us lawyers, and it's something that we should give a lot of consideration to, how to build legal constraints for these private actors that are compliant with international law, through the responsibility of the states that are involved in their operations, and pointing out that they should not be able to escape the responsibility by outsourcing such responsibilities to private actors.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We've got a lot of questions that have come through from the QR code, so I'm glad to see that it's working. And I've got some of my own as well. One I wanted to start with, and apologies because I promised you all an easy ride, but this one's just come to me as you've both been talking. Jim and Andrea, you have both talked about the legal normative framework in which use ad bellum and use in bello sit. For those of you who aren't aware, use ad bellum is the law, broadly speaking, to prevent wars, preventing the use of force, the crime of aggression, and use in bello are those laws that determine the conduct of hostilities. We are mostly lawyers in this room. Lawyers love taxonomies, they love boxes, they love to know that this rule goes in this box and there are 3 elements to this rule and you have to satisfy all 3 in order to make your case. Has that taxonomy between use in bello and use ad bellum become a straitjacket which is actually preventing us from preventing wars, as opposed to just dealing with them retroactively? Open to anyone, but maybe Jim, we'll start with you.
So I'm not sure I would use the term straitjacket, but I don't think that's a bad term. And I do think that we have lost the forest for the trees, or another analogy is that often the excessive concern with use in bello and compliance with use in bello can seem to be an act of arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. One of the things that, for instance, that I teach is the way Human Rights Watch, and I use Human Rights Watch because I used to work for Human Rights Watch, but also because it's sort of, along with Amnesty, one of the 2 flagship leading international human rights organizations, the conscience of the world, etc. And as I said before, they do not, as a matter of their mandate, address use ad bellum, who's right or who's wrong, whether or not there should be an invasion, even though that was the most important crime prosecuted at Nuremberg. And just as an example, I read what Human Rights Watch was writing about just before and during the beginning of the Iraq War, and they're counting violations of IHL. And it's quite evident that had the United States not invaded Iraq in 2003, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives might have been saved. Millions of people might not have been displaced. And so to count up the violations afterwards, while important, really does miss, the main issue, which is avoid violent conflict. War almost invariably, if not invariably, degenerates into mass slaughter and grave violation of humanitarian law. That's what warfare is. Tell people that they can shoot these people but not those people in those circumstances but not those people in the other circumstances is really a fool's errand. It's virtually certain that there will be horror and atrocity. So I think collectively my appeal would be for us as lawyers to move away from counting violations in places and to strengthen our efforts to address use ad bellum.
How do we get from the position we're in now, which is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic as it's sinking, to actually getting the deterrent effect of the prevention of aggression and the prevention of war to the forefront of state action, as opposed to just, Jim, if you're raring to go.
I'm ready to go. And I don't want to monopolize, and I really want to hear from others, but just quickly, when you talk about how the jus ad bellum issue is not raised, it's not prosecuted, the ICC now has changed its statute. It could address these issues. And perhaps I'm suspect because I am a national of the United States and also of Italy, but I'm a national of the United States, and I look at the government of the United States. I'm highly critical of the government of the United States. I'm highly critical of its actions. And I see the interests of the United States lurking almost everywhere, in part because the interests of the United States are lurking almost everywhere. But I raise this because this inclination to address jus ad bellum by Human Rights Watch and other organizations, by civil society, by the ICRC, by important actors, the European Union, et cetera, that disinclination is largely due to an interest in allowing the United States to continue its global hegemony without too much interference, unless you start, United States, to threaten Alberta, Canada, Greenland, right? And as long as, and Mark Carney said this in so many words, by the way, I'm not sure he meant to be so honest, but I can't emphasize enough how important it was, and I see that the head of the Amadeus has raised this as well, but Mark Carney basically said, it's always been a sham. We've always known that the global north can do what it wants in the global south. We just got a free ride. We could trade Canada using US sea lanes and pretending that we had a global order system, but now that you're calling me governor, and now, right? And now that you're threatening to invade Canada, and now that you're threatening to invade Greenland, wait, we would like some rules. Okay, so at one level, I'm like, I want to say, really, mother? Okay. And I know I can't say that. You're all very extraordinarily well-dressed. I'm not wearing a tie. I feel bad. So I won't use profanity. But at one level, I want to say that. And at another level, I'm thinking, great, thank you, finally, right? A parallel situation. If you look at the killings by ICE in Minnesota, Minnesota is one of the whitest places in the United States, people, notwithstanding the Somali community, which is quite significant. But to see the outrage that you're starting to see in the United States, and one of the things that people say all the time, and I can't swallow this, is they see what ICE is doing in Minnesota, and they'll say, this is un-American. And I always want to go, no, that's very American. But it just hasn't been happening to white people in Minnesota, and now it is. And that's in some ways, it's a terrible recognition of the hypocrisy, right? I would say the parallel here is to the hypocrisy of powerful Western nations, European nations, in not calling out abuses in the global South. Oh, how hypocritical. But also, okay, I'm pragmatic. I'm like, okay, so now you care because ICE is masked and killing white people and terrorizing. Okay, well, let's have a discussion about what we need to do to change. Same thing with IHL. Yeah. Let's have a discussion about what we need to change, because the beast has broken loose of all of the previously accepted legitimate borders. Even Venezuela, for instance, which was like, I'm not a fan of Maduro, but who cares? He's the head of state. We have rules. You can't go in, bomb, kill, whatever, kill 80 people, take the head of state and prosecute him in New York. Wait for this one, here's the kicker. For weapons trafficking. That's one of the charges against him in the United States. I mean, it really is too rich for words, people. But sorry, even with Venezuela, the response by the European Union was pathetic, yeah, right? Yeah. But now that it's Greenland, and so there's a moment here where I think, and we'll talk about this on panel 5, there's a real moment. I'm so glad we're having this conversation and this discussion and this conference. It's so opportune, because I really think there's a moment now to change the dynamics of international law.
Thank you. Andrea, I want to bring you and Nada in on this as well. And questions about how this affects broader justice and international law, as Jim, you said, are going to be particularly discussed in panel 5. But when it comes to IHL and ICI, you can respond. You can respond now to however you want. But I know some of your research, Andrea, has been about exactly what Jim said, where the actions of Western states have been recited back to them as justifications for what's happened. And we know that Russia has done this, for example. And Nada, you talked about this when you talked about the US in Iraq and how that was seen in Sudan. So is there now a real recognition that that states, including the P5, have to play on an equal playing field to everyone when it comes to IHL and ICL?
Yes, thank you for the question. And just to reconnect as well this question with what Jim was saying, I think I completely agree with Dionysus, and I think his final point that he made, which is now it's the time to make sure that the rules are applied equally to everyone. I think this is very crucial. So we are now at a moment where the President of the United States is creating basically a completely parallel system that didn't exist before. Is trying to replace the United Nations with a Board of Peace, which again, it's private endeavor and initiative, appointing selected heads of state that are ready to pay billions to join this Board of Peace, and even private individuals that have nothing to do with governance and politics, like billionaires that will join this Board of Peace just on, I don't know, their private position, I guess. So this is very dangerous. This is very scary. This is absolutely terrifying if successful. But at the same time, it sort of gives us an opportunity, because this is the moment in which the United States themselves are sidelining themselves from what was the UN-based legal order. So we know there are a lot of flaws in the UN system, but now perhaps is the moment for all the other nations to just start to ignore the big shouting guy who is just creating their own rules, rather than going along with them, joining the Board of Peace, going along with whatever Trump wants to do. Let's just ignore him and try to really reform the United Nations, which some people are attempting to do for quite some time. But now that the eye of Sauron is pointed elsewhere and they are sidelining themselves, maybe that is the moment to seize for all the other good-willing nations that are ready to promote more just and equal world. Now, going to your question, yes, so something that my research has shown is that, as we have heard, international law is often instrumentalized and played and tweaked to serve the purposes that and the objectives, the geopolitical objectives behind the normative constraint. A clear example of this was, in my opinion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where President Putin did not disregard international law as such, but rather he played it, he tweaked it in a way that fitted his narrative. So President Putin used so-called justifications for the war on Ukraine, like providing humanitarian intervention and humanitarian assistance to Russian nationals in eastern Ukraine, the right to, or the responsibility, the doctrine of the responsibility to protect national abroad, as well as self-defense, using a specific connotation of self-defense here, which is collective self-defense. So Russia invoked the right to intervene in support of the eastern self-declared republics of Donbass, in order to help them fight against what President Putin defined as a terrorist government, that of Ukraine. So you can see here how, if you look at also the proceedings before the ICJ in the Ukraine versus Russia genocide case, Russia consistently goes back to the language and the normative constraints of international law. Now, they are obviously tweaking the facts to fit this narrative, but Russia was not disregarding from the law itself, right? And this is something that I think really is really based on a long-standing tradition of other states, like the US, but also the United Kingdom and other Western countries, Israel, of course, in decades of using the narrative of self-defense or coming up with stretches of the doctrines of self-defense, the unable and unwilling doctrine, the concept of humanitarian intervention in itself. So after decades of Western exceptionalism that stretched the regional meaning of the UN Charter in order to fit their own narratives, then we see Russia doing the same, using the very same rhetoric to justify a war that now the Western states openly declare as absolutely unlawful. And that yet again, when Israel starts its reprisals against, allegedly reprisals against Hamas and unleash a full-scale genocide on Gaza, then again the same rhetoric comes up. And now all the political balances in the story are changed. So I think, so the two conclusions that I want to draw here are, one, that the rules have been played all along by Western countries, and therefore now we also see that used in other different contexts, such as Russia, but also other conflicts where actors play with the rules in the same way that Western countries have done. So it's difficult, it's really difficult not to see the double standard and selectivity in invoking originalist application of those rules when they have been played all along. And then the second conclusion is that, again, right now, and here I come back to my initial point, right now we see something new, which is just a complete disregard of international law whatsoever, which is what the US administration is planning to do with Gaza, but also with any other conflict in the world, with the Board of Peace and this new vision constrained by Trump's morality, as we heard, which is something completely different. It's just ignoring the laws of enshrined in the UN whatsoever. So we're not even trying to justify the actions with some normative justifications, but we're just doing whatever Trump thinks is moral, or whoever is involved in this enterprise, which, as we know, is, again, driven by profit. So once again, perhaps this is the moment to seize international law, take it back to the people, take it back to nations and states that are willing to uphold the basic principles or to reconfigure the basic principles. This is the moment where we can do it at a time where the US and some of his allies are completely getting over them and disregarding them.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That brings me on to what is going to be my last question. We've had a very engaging debate, and for those who are wondering where Adama's video is, we've actually spent this time on the debate because we thought that was the most engaging part, and we're going to make sure that we have a place that you can watch or have a link to Adama's talk, because it is very good. Nada, coming back to you, and then anyone else who wants to comment briefly on this last question. We've just been discussing the use and abuse of language in international law. States who engage in violations of international humanitarian law, who engage in the crime of aggression, have used the cloak of international legal language to justify their actions, most often by reference to what Western powers have done. And in an attempt diplomatically to try and address a lot of the questions that have been here that relate to Gaza, questions that relate to the P5, questions that relate to powerful states. Is this now, as Andrea says, an opportunity for us to start from a clean slate, a real level of equality when it comes to international humanitarian law and international criminal law, now that the hegemony of the United States appears to be fracturing? Is this the opportunity now, rather than all jump on board with the Board of Peace and the gross Gaza Riviera project, is it now actually the time to say, well, there's a way to restart? As a matter of, at least as a matter of international humanitarian law, as a matter of international criminal law, as a matter of jus ad bellum, there's a way to restart and to say we're going to drop the fake language that suggests that we are complying with international humanitarian law, and bring in everybody, particularly the global south. And if there are others who don't want to participate or who want to use the language of international law and abuse it, they can just be excluded from that order?
Thank you for the question. I think this is a bit of a difficult question to answer, primarily because you say, should we abstain from kind of going along with this Board of Peace thing, when actually it was the UNSC who approved it, right? Like, so in a very kind of entirely absurd move, because it marginalized itself by legislating for the establishment of the Board of Peace. But I think this goes back to the question of the privatization of humanitarian aid provisioning, recovery, and the kind of functions that the UN traditionally discharged, right? And it's not surprising that we got to this point, because I think there is also a question about the ultimate kind of end point of capitalism and what it's likely to generate. And I say this with the cognizance that what is happening in Sudan is at times also profit-driven, yes, and focused on resource exploitation. But going back to the question of, is this a time for us to do something different? And I think it is. And I think in terms of what lawyers are able to do in this regard, you asked about the demarcation between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. I think the problem that lawyers generally suffer from is not that we tend to think of rules in like a compartmentalized fashion. I think the problem that we suffer from, especially in the global north, is that lawyers assume that the law is neutral. The recognition that there is such a thing as the politics of international law has always been there in the global south. So at the time of the Nuremberg trial as well. Yeah. So global south scholars have always seen the world for what it is and seen these like dynamics and the interplay of geopolitics into the creation of international law. So we're not just talking about applying the rules of international law. We're also talking about the process of making these rules and, yeah, who makes them and who is in the room when they are made and so on and so forth. So I think this is a moment, a sobering moment, because as Andrea and also Jim had said, the practice of the current US administration brings to the forefront of global North thinking that the reality of almost inconsequentialness of international law norms, which the global South has always suffered from. So in a sense, there is an equality of arms as such, like there is a level playing field, in the sense that this basically means that we are all subject or exposed to the kind of effects that are the result of hegemonic action, right? Yes. So, but yeah, I think for me personally, I think the way to do this is to be very aware of the fact that law is not law as neutral, but it actually comes with politics, and you have to engage with the politics of international law in order to do this. So. No, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this panel. Could I please ask all of you to join me in thanking our three fantastic speakers and our panelists before we move on to panel 2. Thank you.
Well done.